we read Parshas Boy. And in Parshas Boy, one of the central mitzvahs is the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. So, ויאמר השם אל מוישה, החודש הזה לכם ראש חדושים, ראשון לכם, דברו על בני ישראל אמר, ועושה לחודש הזה ויקרא למיש, סלע וייס, סלע וייס. שא תומם בן זוכר, יהיה לכם מן הכוסם מן אויזם תיקוחו, ואוהר לכם למשמעס עד ארבעוס, יום לחודש הזה, ושחטו וייסי כל קהל עדס ישראל בין הארבעים. And besides the mitzvah of Shlitas HaPesach and Akrovas HaPesach, ואוכלו הסבוסה בלילה, הזץ לישו מצס על מרוירים יאכלו. So the Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch, who usually goes together with the Rambam, so the Rambam mitzvahs say Nun Hey and mitzvahs say Nun Vav. Sefer mitzvahs following the footsteps of the Rambam. Mitzvah Nun Hey, Nun Vav. Mitzvah Hey and Vav in Sefer HaChinuch. Both enumerate, count two mitzvahs, Asiyas HaPesach and Achilas Besar HaPesach. They are two different and distinct mitzvahs. However, Rabbeinu Sadi Goyen, in his Sefer HaMitzvahs, Mitzvah Mem Zayin only gives one slot out of the Taryag for Korban Pesach, Hakrovas HaPesach, ve'Achilas Besar. So according to Rabbeinu Sadi Goyen, which is the Ikar and which is the Tafel, would we say that the mitzvah is Hakrovas HaPesach? One of the details of Hakrovas HaPesach is Achilas Besar HaPesach. Shaharei Belav Hachi, all the Karbonas, we have one mitzvah for Hakrovas HaChatas, another mitzvah Hakrovas HaShlomim, and another mitzvah Hakrovas HaOshom. Each and every one of these mitzvahs has different parts, different actions. So every korban necessitates at least 4 different deeds. Shchita, Kabbalah, Hoilocha, Zrika. Those are defined as Arbat, Daled, Avodas Adam. And then comes Haktoras Eimerim. And Haktoras Eimerim is not Miyakev. So one could say the Ikar Mitzvah is Akrovas HaPesach and Achilas Besar HaPesach is one of the details. Or would we say the opposite? The Ikar Mitzvah is Achilas HaPesach. In order that we should be able to eat Korban Pesach, we need to bring a Pesach. Otherwise, how could we eat Besar HaPesach? So if Rabbeinu Sadi Gaon counts the two as one mitzvah, what would be the Ikar Mitzvah? What would be either Achana, a Hechsher, or a detail? On one hand, it seems to be obvious that the Ikar Mitzvah would be a Akrovas Korban Pesach, because if somebody doesn't bring the Korban Pesach, Chayav Koros. Akrovas HaKorban is an Asay Sheyesh Bekoros. If you don't eat the Korban Pesach, Bitul Mitzvah Asay, but there is no Koros. So it's extremely unreasonable that the Tofel has a Koros and the Ikar Mitzvah is not Koros. So I think it would be far more reasonable to say that the Ikar Mitzvah is Akrovas HaPesach and one of the Plota Mitzvah is Achilas Besar HaPesach. So P'sachim Nefayim, there's a machlokes, Achila Ma'akva or Achila Lo Ma'akva. If you brought the Korban and you didn't eat the Besar HaPesach, were you yoytze the mitzvah of Akrovas HaKorban or not? So if we say, as Achila Lo Ma'akva, we definitely would assume that the Ikar Mitzvah is Akrovas HaKorban. But if we say Achila Ma'akeves, then there still would be room to argue that if you don't eat Besar HaPesach, neither were you yoytze the mitzvah of Hakrovas Korban Pesach, and in that case, one could once again argue. So it is clear that Achilas Besar HaPesach is different than Achilas Shar HaKorbanos. Because only by Korban Pesach there is a din in Mesechet Psochim that all the other Korbanos boim betumah, aval einam necholam betumah. Korban Pesach, Korban shekora betumah, nechal betumah. And this halacha indicates that Achilas HaPesach is different than Achilas Shar HaKorbanos. All the other Korbanos we have it in Tumota B'tzibah, but Tumota B'tzibah is only to bring the Korban. Never do we find by other Korbanos that you could eat a Korban, eat Achilas Kodshim B'tumah, only by Pesach. because Pesach stands apart, and Korban Pesach is the only Korban in which each and every Jew, once a year, has to bring Korban Pesach, and has to be part of it, has to be mourning ala Korban, and he needs to eat mevisara Korban. And that is different than all the other Korbanos. And therefore, there would be room to argue that the Ikar Mitzvah is Achilas Pesach and Aklovas Korban is just as an introduction and as the means we should be able to eat the Korban Pesach. But bearing in mind that Aklovas Korban, Yesh Bo Koros, and Achilas Korban, Ein Bo Koros, so I think it would be more reasonable to say, according to Rabbeinu Sadigon, the Ikar Mitzvah is Haklovas Korban and not Achilas Besorah. However, at this point I would like to make a comment, and this is a very relevant comment because that is my feeling in many, many different sugyas. So many of the Achronim, when they want to define a mitzvah, the source, one of the basic sources is Sifrei HaMitzvahs. The Rambam, the Ramban, the Rasag, the Halachos Gedolos, the Areim, the Smag, the Smak. All these are the Rishonim that dealt with mitzvahs. However, my feeling in most cases is when one Rishon counts two different mitzvahs and the other counts one mitzvah, it is not necessarily that they have differences of opinion in Agdoras and mitzvahs. I think the differences in opinion would be how do we define Taryag? And the machlokes would be what is the methodology? How do we define Taryag? And it is not necessarily machlokes and Agdoras and mitzvahs. In our case, I think Rabbeinu Sadigon would definitely agree that Aklovas HaKorban and Achilas HaKorban are two mitzvahs. But in the methodology of Taryag, maybe these two mitzvahs are counted as one, because both are associated with the Korban Pesach. So I think in most cases in which we find, I could give many examples, the Rambam and the Ramban have a machlokes. Whether Afrosh's Tumas and Nesina's Tumah L'Kohen V'Levi are two mitzvahs or one mitzvah. And the Achronim have Gevaldige Pelpulim in Hagdoras, and I say, I don't think it's necessarily machlokes in the Hagdoras, a mitzvah of Afrosh's Tumah and Nesina's Tumah L'Kohen. It's just a machlokes. How do we reach the ultimate number of 613 of Taryag? What are the klolim? When are mitzvahs defined as two separate slots in the magic number of Taryag, and when do we stack them together? So it's not necessarily that the Rambam and the Ramban have a machlokes in the linkage between Afrosha and Nesina. It's merely, it might be a machlokes just how do we define the number of Taryag, and I argue the same in our case. I think it goes without saying that a Aklovas HaKorban and Achilas HaBosor must be two mitzvahs, especially if we say Achila Lo Ma'akle. So obviously there are two mitzvahs. But so the machlokes would be two separate mitzvahs, mitzad Agdora, but maybe in the minyan of Taryag they are counted as one. And this brings us to, once again, to readdress the question, Achilas HaPesach, is it different than Achilas Shar HaKorbanos? Is there b'chlal a mitzvah to say to eat Kodshim Kalim? Pesach is Kodshim Kalim, not Kodshim Kodshim. Chatas v'osher are Kodshim Kodshim. The Tomi, but the Oilo, but Korban Pesach is Kodshim Kalim. Is there b'chlal a mitzvah to say in Achilas Kodshim Kalim? That's a machlokes in the Shoinim. And it's very, very interesting that Tzlach in Beit Daf Yud Tesom in the Beis deals with this question. And the sugya he deals with, is it shayach by Kodshim Kalim to say asay doichalot asay? Is there b'chlal a mitzvah to say to eat Kodshim Kalim? Could I have a Rambam Karbonis if someone knows where the Rambam would be? Avoida and Karbonis, are they the same volume? So the Tzlach is Mesupik, and he writes, I did not find clear sources whether Achilas Kodshim Kalim is a mitzvah, and he brings two sources in the Rambam, which seem to prove that Kodshim Kalam, there is no mitzvah b'achilosam. Perek Yud Aloch Aleph, Hilchas Ma'aseh Karbonos, Kosav Rambam. Achiles achadas v'osham, mitzvah asay, shene'emar v'ochlo oisam ma'asher kupa behem, v'ayim oichlem v'al ba'alam miskaprim, v'hu hadin l'shar HaKodshim, she'oichlem ha'koyanim, she'achiloson mitzvah. So the Rambam clearly seems to say, oichlem ha'koyanim, achiloson mitzvah. Kodshim Kalam is not a mitzvah. And it's like, argues, we could learn the same from the very beginning of Masa HaKorbanos, and the Rambam counts the various different mitzvahs that we have in Masa HaKorbanos. And in mitzvah, what number is it? So, Sholosh ve'esra mitzvahs we find in Masa Karbonos. Mitzvah Zayin, sheyorchlu ha'koyanim busa kodsha Kodshim b'migdash. Mitzvah Tes, shelo yorchlu zar mekodsha Kodshim. Mitzvah Yud Aleph, shelo lechol busa Kodshim kalam koidim zlikas damim. But he doesn't bring a mitzvah Kodshim kalam hanacholim lebalim. So the Tzlach argues, twice do we find in Masa Karbonos. Obviously, the Rambam maintains that there is no mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim Kalim. Korban Pesach is definitely different, but Hilchas Korban Pesach stands apart. Besides Masa Karbonos, we find in the Rambam Hilchas Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach definitely is a mitzvah. I'm dealing with other Kodshim Kalim. And it's a pella on the Tzlach that he doesn't bring Rashi in three different sources in Shas. Neither does he bring the Machlokes Rambam and Sefer HaMitzvahs. And to me, this is a mystery. The Tzlach, like many other of the greatest Gedolim, were not familiar with Sefer HaMitzvahs Rambam. And it's a shtickle pella. Sefer HaMitzvahs is one of the most important swarm that the Rambam wrote, and many Achronim weren't very thoroughly versed in Sefer HaMitzvahs, so the Rambam doesn't bring. The Rambam clearly writes, mitzvah say pay test, and that is the mitzvah of Achilas Besar HaZevach. And the Rambam says the mitzvah say of Achilas Kodshim refers only to Kodsha Kodshim. And he quotes the Gemara in Pesachim Daf Nun Tes, V'ochlu oisam asher kupar behem melamed shekoyanim oichlem u'baalem eskaprim. The lesson of the Gemara is koyanim oichlem v'baalem eskaprim. And then the Rambam writes, Kodshim kalam anacholim le'baalem and truma hanacheres lekoyen Nigrorim achrei ha-mitzvah. And I quoted this Rambam a few times. Some of you will probably recall and remember. It's an interesting Agdora that we find nowhere else in the Rambam, only in Mitzvah Sasei Peites. Nigrorim achrei ha-mitzvah. Which means there is somewhat of a mitzvah b'Kodshim Kalam as well, but it is not fully defined as a mitzvah Sasei, because v'ochlu oisam asher kupa behem is interpreted by Chazal, Malamed shekoyanim oichlem v'baalem eskabim. So the Rambam clearly says Kodshim Kalam is somewhat of a mitzvah, but not a mitzvah gemura. Nigrorim achrei ha-mitzvah. So I would agree with the Tzlach that according to the Rambam, we wouldn't say esed leichal oisese, because an esed should override an oisese. It needs to be a full-fledged mitzvah say, and not like Kodshim Kalam shenigrorim achrei ha-mitzvah. But Rashi, three different sources in Shas, it is very clear in Rashi that Kodshim Kalam and Acholim Lebalim is a mitzvah gemura, just like Kodsha Kodshim. So Rashi is in Pesachim Nun Tes Amud Aleph, in that very same source, Koyanim Oichlem V'Baalim Eskaprim. Rashi says, and the same applies to Kodshim Kalam and Acholim Lebalim. It is the same mitzvah to say, and that is also what Rashi writes in Chulin Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Rashi Broches Mem Ches Amud Beis also says that it's a mitzvah to say Kodshim Kalam Acholim Lebalim. However, Rashi brings a different posuk. Mishnah Torah Perek Yud Beis. V'habosa te'ochel. So Rashi quotes a different posuk. But Rashi, three different sources in Shas. Brochas Memches, Pesachim Nun Tes, Chulin Yud Beis. Rashi says, Kodshim Kalam and Acholim Lebalim is a mitzvah to say. And the Ramban. And the very first mitzvah that the Ramban argues that the Rambam omitted, mitzvah to say Aleph Sheshochach Harav, the Ramban writes, I wonder why the Rambam doesn't count Kodshim, Kalam, and Acholim, Rabbanim as a mitzvah say. And the Ramban quotes Posuk number 3. And the Ramban argues, Dvorim, Perik Yudaled, V'ochalto lefnei Hashem Elokechem, Masa degoncho, Siroshcha v'yitzorecho b'choyres, v'kacho v'yitzoinecho. This is the source that there's a mitzvah say, Ba'achilas ha'bechor, ha'bokor v'atzoin, and those are Kodshim Kalam. So we find 3 different psukim. But Rashi and the Ramban clearly maintain we're dealing with a mitzvah say. The Rambam feels Kodshim Kalam and Acholim Rabbanim Nigrorim Achrei HaMitzvah. So in Minchas Osha Mesechet Psochim, and once again in Minchas Osha, I think it's Parshas Tzav, I wrote at great length to define the mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim. We won't go over that right now. Today I want to focus more on Korban Pesach, but it is relevant that there is a machlokes, obviously Rambam against Rashi and the Ramban, whether Kodshim Kalam and Acholim Rabbanim is a mitzvah say, or it is not defined as a mitzvah say. Achilas B'sar Pesach is definitely a mitzvah say. But there's an additional difference between Kodshim Kalam and Korban Pesach. Pesach is the only korban in which each and every individual must bring a korban achas l'shona, and that is the Korban Pesach. It is a mitzvah to say sheyesh bekoros, and everyone needs to partake in Achilas Korban Pesach. So the Beis Halevi has a great yesod. Tshuvas Beis Halevi Chelek Aleph Siman Beis. So the Beis Halevi bases his chiddush on a kasha that really isn't a kasha, at least not in the way the Beis Halevi formulates it. Beis Halevi quotes a sefer היוםהשחור, which is one of the early and very important svarim of the Rambam, meforshim of the Rambam. And the היוםהשחור wonders why only in Korban Pesach do we find 2 different mitzvahs, Hakrovas HaKorban v'Achilas B'sar HaKorban. All the other karbonos, Achilas HaBasar, is part of the mitzvah of Hakrovas HaKorban. That is the question of היוםהשחור. I don't think he answers. But the Beis Halevi answers, and the Beis Halevi is mechanish. The mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim is not to eat Kodshim. Only שהקודשים יאכלו. אין המצווה, אין חפץ המצווה בעצם האכילה, אלא שהקודשים יאכלו. וחסם סופר, תשובס חסם סופר, אורח חיים סמקוף מם, once again חסם סופר חידושה מסכת נדורם דף י' זין, goes to a greater extreme, and he writes, by all the other karbonos, we need to eat, only it should not be noisa. But only by Korban Pesach there is a positive mitzvah of achilas b'sar hapesach. I wonder about what the Chassam Sofer says. All the other karbonos is only shouldn't be noisa. V'zo minayin lacho. I mean, after all, Rashi and the Ramban maintain it's a mitzvah to say. Even according to the Rambam, it is somewhat of a mitzvah to say. Nigrorin achrei mitzvah. So how do we know that the entire objective of Achilas B'sar HaKarbonos is only it should not be noisa? And why wouldn't we say everybody agrees there's a mitzvah in Achilas HaBasar? And the mitzvah to say of Achilas HaKorban and the lav of Lo Yisosiru are not 2 sides of the same coin, 2 different mitzvahs. The Beis Halevi doesn't tie Achilas HaKodshim into noisa, but he does say all the other karbonos, the mitzvah is שהקודשים יאכלו. Only by Korban Pesach there's a mitzvah of achila, and therefore only Korban Pesach each and every individual needs to eat a kazayas, because shir achila b'kazayas. Other kodshim you don't need to eat a kazayas, because the mitzvah is between the group, the Beisav, the Mishmar, you are all responsible to finish, eat, B'sar HaZevach, and the Menuchas. And therefore, there's no kpei that each and every kohen should eat a kazayas. If there's not much basar, and there are many kahanim, everybody could eat puchas mekazayas. Because the definition of the mitzvah is שהקודשים יאכלו על ידי מי שחייב לאכול אותם. Only Korban Pesach. Achilas B'sar Pesach would be similar to Achilas Matzah, to Achilas Maror, which is a positive mitzvah, and not only a mitzvah שהקודשים יאכלו, אלא לאכול. That's the Chiddush of the Beis HaLevi. Now, the Beis HaLevi asks the question, and he calls this question in the name of Mayan HaChochma. Only by Korban Pesach, HaKrovas HaKorban, and Achilas HaBos are two different mitzvahs. Regarding all the others, Achilas B'sar HaKorban is part of the mitzvahs HaKrova. That is not correct. By all the Kodshim, Achilas HaBosar is a separate mitzvah. It is not part of mitzvahs HaKrova. Achilas B'sar HaKorbanos is mitzvahs Asay Peites, Achilas HaMenochas, mitzvahs Asay Peiches. Sefer HaChinuch, also two separate mitzvahs. And lo kedivrei Mayan HaChochma, and below kedivrei Beis HaLevi, that they assume all the other karbonos, mitzvahs achil is part of mitzvahs ha'akrova, and that is not so. By all the karbonos, akrova l'chod, v'achil l'chod. But the Mayan HaChochma and the Beis HaLevi are right in a way. The zikah, the yachas, the relationship between akrova and achila is different by Korban Pesach than by all the other karbonos. And let me explain how. Maybe the biggest chunk of mitzvahs in Sefer HaMitzvahs LaRambam is karbonos. All the way from Malamed Tes to Ayin Zayin, 38 mitzvahs are krovas karbonos. Not mamish, because Bein Hashar Simchas HaRegel is also included in that broad category. But the vast majority of the mitzvahs from Melamed Tet to Ayin Zayin is akrovas karbonos. When it comes to achilas karbonos, we don't have a separate mitzvah achilas achatas, achilas ha'osham, achilas ha'toido, achilas ha'shlomim. There is one mitzvah to say, which includes achilas kol b'sar hazvochim, and another mitzvah to say, which includes achilas kol ha'menachos. And that is a relevant question. So why isn't Pesach part of achilas b'sar karbonos? Why does Pesach stand apart? And only by Pesach, achilas b'sar Pesach is a mitzvah b'fnei atzmoi. Achilas b'sar achatos is not a mitzvah b'fnei atzmoi. B'sar osham is not a mitzvah b'fnei atzmoi. Achilas hazvochim is one mitzvah. So the question should not be formulated in the way Mayan HaChochma formulates it. That's a mistake. But I think the question is still relevant in a different nisuach. And therefore I think the Beis HaLevi is right with his response. So he says, regarding all the other karbonos, it's one general mitzvah. B'sar HaKodesh tzarich sheye'achel על ידי הכוהנים שהמצווה מוטלת עליהם. It is only by Korban Pesach that the mitzvah is a positive mitzvah and not only one of a negative nature. And therefore, only by Korban Pesach do we find that each and every one needs to eat a kezayis. And that is why, once again, only by Korban Pesach do we find Pesach shobor b'tuma, nechol b'tuma, שמתחיל אליי בא, אלו לאכילה, מה שאין כן כל שאר הקורבנות. And this brings us to an interesting sugya that we find twice in Shas Hoyis Daf Yud and in Nozir Daf Chav Gimel. Chazal speak about the Posek. Ma yidachsev, Yeshorim darkei Hashem, tzadikim yelchu ba, lepoishim yekoshlu ba. Moshe למד עבודayim. שניים שעשו עשה פסח. אחד אוכל לשם מצווה ואחד אוכל אכילה גסה. זה שאוכל לשם מצווה ישורים ילכו בו. זה שאוכל לשם אכילה גסה פוישים יקושלו בו. And then the Gemara asks, ראש קורס לי? נהי דלוי עוביד מצווה מן המובחר, פסח מיהו כעוביד. So the lesson of the Gemara in Nozi is, why do you call him a Rosha? Why does the Pasuk say, Pushim Yakoshluba? He didn't do a mitzvah min hamufcha, but after all, he was makar the Korban Pesach. That's the Lashon of the Gemara in Nozichov Gimel. Hoyri is the Yud. The Lashon is Rosh Koroslei Nehi Delayoved Mitzvah Namu for Pesach Miu Ka'ochil. So in Hoyri is the Gemara says Pesach Ka'ochil. In Nozia, Pesach Ka'ovid. What is the difference between the two? So on one hand, maybe the Lashon of the Gemara in Nozichov Gimel, Pesach Miu Ka'ovid, would seem to indicate that the mitzvah of Achilas Korban Pesach is a tofel. The Ikar mitzvah is Akrovas HaKorban, and not Achilas HaKorban. So Achilas HaKorban is just the detail. After all, he was Makar of Korban Pesach. But the Lashon in Horius would indicate, so maybe the Gemara in Nozia would be a source of Rabbeinu Sadi Goin, that it's one mitzvah, and the Gemara in Horius would be a source to the Rambam that would deal with two different mitzvahs. But I argued before, I don't think there's a machlokes and a shonim in the definition of the mitzvahs. Maybe it's more a question, what is the method and how do we reach the number of Taryag? So I don't think that is the point. So Tosfos, Psochim Kuv Zayin, explains the Lashon of the Gemara, Pesach Miya Ka'ovid. So why wouldn't it be a Rosh? Because he didn't eat the Pesach. Because Achille lo ma'akve. But that's a wonder. Achille lo ma'akve is pshat that you yoytza mitzvah sakrova Pesach, even though you didn't eat. But everybody would agree that Achilles Pesach is a mitzvah. And he was mavatal the mitzvah. So, one would argue, bitul mitzvah say doesn't make you a Rosh. Didn't I give a shiur lately about Psulei Edus? Yeah, 2 weeks ago. And I quoted the simple halacha, Kodshim mishpat siman amad. You're not posel edus unless you violated a lav sheyesh bo malchus. Because bitul mitzvah say, you're not defined as a rosh. So maybe that's the kasha of the Gemara. Korban Pesach yesh bekoros. So it is at least as harsh as a lav. Not many lavin have koros. But Achilas a Pesach ain't bekoros. So it's just a bitul mitzvah say. A bitul mitzvah say you're not a rosh. And that's why the Gemara says, Pesach miyakovid. As long as he wasn't mevatel the mitzvah of a krovas korban Pesach, he's not a rosh. The Lashon in Horius Daf Yud goes beyond that. And the Gemara in Horius says, he even was yoysa the mitzvah of Achilas a Pesach. It's not a mitzvah min hamufcha because he ate it achila gasa. He didn't eat l'tiyavoin. But after all, not only was he makayim the mitzvah of akrovas hakorban, he even has the mitzvah of achilas hakorban. So the Beis Halevi l'shitosoi goes into a purple, and the Beis Halevi says, if you eat something achila gasa, it is not really defined as achila. However, regarding shar kol kodshim, you're yoytze even with achila gasa. Regarding Korban Pesach, you're not yoytze with achila gasa. Because regarding other kabbonos, after all, the mitzvah is shekodshim ya'achlu, v'harei ne'achlu. What's the difference? How? But achilas Pesach is a positive mitzvah. You need to eat. And achila gasa is not defined as achila. So the Beis Halevi comes up with a gevaldige chiddush, and he argues, when you eat Besar Pesach, you have two different mitzvahs. The mitzvah of achilas Pesach and the mitzvah of achilas korbanos. After all, Pesach is a korban. And if there is a general mitzvah, lechol besar hazevach, that would apply to Korban Pesach as well. So when you eat Korban Pesach, you have two different mitzvahs. You have the positive mitzvah of achilas besar Pesach, which you cannot be yoytze unless you eat a kazayas, and you have an additional mitzvah of besar hazevach. Pesach, after all, is one of the zvochim. And according to Rashi, that there's a mitzvah to say, Kodshim kalam hanacholim lebalim, that would apply to Korban Pesach as well. And here, the Beis Halevi comes up with this big chiddush, and he says, Nei delakeh mitzvah min hamifcha, aber Pesach miyeh ka'ochel, which means he doesn't have the mitzvah of achilas Pesach, but he still has the mitzvah of achilas Kodshim. To me, that would be an amazing chiddush. Too amazing. I don't think it's reasonable that a person eats Korban Pesach has two mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah לאכול את כל בשר הזבוחים. יש מצווה מיוחדת לאכול את הפסח. When you eat the Pesach, that is, you're not eating a chatos, you're not eating an osho, you're not eating a bchor, you're not eating maiso, you're eating Korban Pesach. And this is the mitzvah of achilas Pesach. So I don't think it's reasonable to say that when a person eats a Pesach, he has two different mitzvahs. I think that when Chazal speak about achila gasa, it's, Tosis many sources in Shas. One of them is Yevamos Lametes. Tosis says there are two different types of achila gasa. One is achila gasa in which he doesn't eat litayavoin, and that is not a mitzvah min hamufchar, and that is the achila gasa of Nozia and Hoirius. Echad ochloi l'shem mitzvah, and the other ate achila gasa. There's an achila gasa which the Gemara says in Yuma that is put in Yom Kippurim. That is when katz b'macholoi. He is so overeaten that, he's nauseated by additional food. That is similar to shelo kederach achila. And in that case, one cannot be yotzei the mitzvah, so it would be far more reasonable to say the achila gasa that we're dealing with those two sugyas, nausea and hodius, is an achila gasa which still in the boundaries, still in the limits of derech achila, and one is yotzei, and therefore the Gemara says he didn't eat l'shem shemaim, he didn't eat l'tiyoven, he didn't eat mitzvah min hamuvchar, but after all, Pesach miu ka'ochil. So there are two other achronim that say something similar to the Beis Halevi. So the Beis Halevi says when you eat Besara Pesach, you're actually mekayim two different mitzvahs. And one is Achilas HaKarbonis. The other is Achilas Korban Pesach. And they're different. Because Achilas Karbonis, you're yotzei even shelo kederach achila. Achilas HaPesach, you're not yotzei only kederach achila. Or Sameach. Perek Vav. Korban Pesach. The Or Sameach comes up with a similar chiddush, but maybe even a greater chiddush than the Beis Halevi. And he says, Machlokes said the Kiva Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, whether Achilas Pesach was ad Chatzois or ad Aboiker. And the Or Sameach says, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Achilas Pesach is ad Chatzois. But you could still eat Korban Pesach after Chatzois till Alois Shachar. You're no longer Makayim the mitzvah of Achilas Pesach, but you're still Makayim the mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim. That's an amazing chiddush. Or Sameach comes to B'miyashiv, Tosfos Kashi. How could Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say that Achilas Pesach is at Chatzois when the Pesach says, V'hanoi lo yisosiru mimenu ad boiker, and that is referring to Korban Pesach. So doesn't that support the Bekiva's shitta, the Achilas Pesach, Adar Shachar, lo yisosiru mimenu ad boiker? So the Or Sameach, Rabbi Meir Simcha says no. Lo yisosiru mimenu ad boiker. Because you could still eat the Korban Pesach from Chatzois till Alois Shachar, and you will be Makayim the mitzvah of Achilas Mesaras Vochim, but you no longer will be Makayim the mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach. So we have the Beis Halevi, Reb Meir Simcha, and now we have a family legend, the Beis Halevi, Reb Chaim, and the Brisker. So the Beis Halevi is the one, and the earliest who was Machadish that there are Shnei Dinam Achilas HaPesach. A double mitzvah kfulo v'mechupeles. The mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach, and an additional mitzvah, Achilas HaZerach. Rabbi Meir Simcha says the same. Rabbi Meir Simcha goes beyond that, and he says, even according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you need to eat, if you want to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach, you have time at Chatzois, but you could still go on and eating that Korban Pesach, and Alois Shachar, and you're Mekayim the mitzvah of Achilas HaZerach. So the Brisker of in Ksavim, Savochim Daftes, brings in the name of his great father, Reb Chaim, who, as you know, was the son of the Beis Halevi. Reb Chaim is similar to the Or Sameach. Similar, but different. And I think the Briskerov and Reb Chaim are far more reasonable. And they argue, Achilas HaPesach is at Chatzois, and no longer than Chatzois. However, the Isser of Noisa is the general rule, and that is Ad Boiker. You have no mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach Le'achar Chatzois. However, Noisa doesn't depend on Sof Zman Achilas HaPesach. Noisa depends on Sof Zman Achilas HaKorbonis, and that is Lo Yisosino Memenu Ad Boiker. But Reb Chaim and the Briskerov fall short of arguing that if you eat Korban Pesach V'achar Chatzois, you still have a mitzvah of Achilas Shar Kodshim. So I think it is very unreasonable to say that even after there's no longer a mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach, you still have the mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim. And it is not even reasonable to say that when you eat Korban Pesach, you have two mitzvahs. One is Achilas HaPesach and the other is Achilas HaZevach. Why wouldn't we say the same about Korban Chatas? You have a mitzvah of Chatas, Achilas HaZevach. No, Chatas it can be said, because there is no mitzvah of Achilas Chatas. It's just the general mitzvah of Achilas HaZevach. But still I say, Achilas HaPesach is a Zevach, so you don't have another mitzvah of Achilas HaZevach. All the Briskerov brings in the name of his great father Reb Chaim is that there's a difference between Sov Zman Achilas HaPesach and Zman Lav Shel Noisa. And even though, according to Reb Rosa ben Azariah, the Zman of Achilas HaPesach is at Chatzois, but it would not be Noisa, only Ba'alois HaShachar. And that is the point in which Reb Chaim differs from the Beis HaLevi and Reb Meir Simcha. So these are three great Gedolim of the Litvish world, the Beis HaLevi, Reb Chaim Briskerov, and Reb Meir Simcha, who come up with similar ideas, but they're similar, but not necessarily exactly the same, as I explained. Coming back to the different sugyas in Nozia and in Horius, when the Gemara says, Poishim tzadikim yechobam, Poishim yikoshlim bam, this brings us to various different yesoides that we learn from this sugya. But I think different opportunities, spoke about other aspects of this sugya. And it is also part of a discussion, is one, yoitze the mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim, Ba'achila Shelo Kederach Hanoah. Is one yoitze b'chlal mitzvah to say, Ba'achila Shelo Kederach, because we do not find in Shas a sugya of Shelo Kederach Achila only referring to Macholas Asuros. And that is in Psachim Daf Chov Bein. So when a person eats Macholas Asuros Shelo Kederach Achila, he doesn't have a law. It's not an Issa D'Oraisa. It is an Issa D'Rabbanan, but not an Issa D'Oraisa. And there's a Chaykas and Achronim. Would the same rule apply to mitzvahs asay of Achila? Whether it's Achilas HaPesach, Achilas Mora, Achilas Kodshim, Oichel, Achilas mitzvah, Shelo Kedei Achila. Is he yoitze or is he not yoitze? Toras Chaim, Chulin Daf Kuf Chav, says this rule only applies to Macholas Asuros. Regarding Achilas mitzvah, doesn't matter. Even if Achilas Shelo Kedei still would be Achila. Noid B'Yudis in Melamed Madura Kamar Chaim disagrees, and then Noid B'Yudis says the basic definition of Achila should be the same, and I think that the Noid B'Yudis is right, because it's not Exeris HaKosev that Achila Shelo Kedei is not defined as Achila. Nowhere in Shas do we find Exeris HaKosev. It's a Svora, and if it's a Svora, it should apply to Achilas Mitzvah, just as it applies to Shelo Kedei Achila regarding Macholas Asuros. These are two different areas in Torah in which there's a din of Achila, either a positive one or a negative one, either Shabbatais or Kumbasei. But the basic definition of Achila should be the same. And the same applies to Achila Gasa. If we say there is no Isa B'Yom Kippurim B'Achila Gasa, there also should be no mitzvah of Achilas Pesach B'Achila Gasa, and therefore, as I quoted before, Tosfos explains there are two different concepts of Achila Gasa. So if we do assume that Achilas Mitzvah needs to be Derech Achila, this would bring us to quite an interesting question. do we eat moror kederech achila? Would that be defined as derech achila? Coughing your gal, and would that be in any way defined as derech achila? So let us not forget, there are chameshes min moror. 4 out of the 5 are quite reasonable. You eat chasa, would be defined as derech achila. We eat chasa all year. It is somewhat bitter, but it appeals to our palate. So, but tamche, obviously, at least the way we eat tamche, would that be defined as derech achila? So some achronim, including the Masham, say other achilas mitzvah need to be derech achila, but moror is an exception, because the entire objective of moror is lemarer espir shelo oichel zeichel avim moror u'schayim. That's the lashon of the Rashbam of Pesachim Kuf Tezvav, and therefore by moror there is no din of derech achila, because the entire reasoning and objective of achilas moror is just to have the bad memories of the moror u'schayim, but it still would be a chiddush. Because after all, the pasuk says al matzos embroidered yirichluhu, and why would there be a difference between moror and matzah? So I don't recall whether we spoke about this ba'asa kedusha u'dain, but I think we did either last year or a year before Pesach, and we discussed the mitzvah of achilas moror. And I told you, a personal experience that once transpired in my home that, when I prepared the moror erev Pesach, it seemed to be so sharp. So I asked my wife, leave it open for a half hour before the Seder. And when it came to moror, Belela Seder, nobody coughed, nobody was nauseated, and it was very calm. And my daughter said, this is not moror, we're not yoitza. And it was the first time in my life that I actually felt that tamche is bitter. Because when it's so sharp, you don't really feel the bitter taste. And it was entirely, how do you say that in English? Ausgewebt. Is that English? It was entirely ausgewebt and wasn't sharp at all. And it was the first time in my life that I actually understood why this is called the moror, because charifus and merirus are not the same. And the Shoel Meishiv actually makes this argument, and he says that tamche has 2 different distinctions. It's mar and it's charif. And when the charifus is diminished, it is then that you feel the merirus. So that was an interesting experience, but I didn't do it again. Because, it's minhag avoseinu b'yadeinu, and the Mishnah Berurah quotes from the Gra that you should not leave it open and you should cover it. It should not be meifig tamoi. So that's what our parents and grandparents did. That's what we keep on doing, even though once I had that accident, and it was then that I really realized and felt that tamche is mar, just like the other types of moror are actually mar. So we touched upon the issue of achila gasa by mitzvahs, and the same argument is regarding shelo kederech achila b'mitzvahs, as I explained. So in this week's parsha, Parshas Boy, we learn about the later of the Aseres HaMakos, of the 10 plagues. L'man tesaper b'yazne bincho, even Pinchos asher istalalti b'Mitzrayim v'esoisai asher samti vam. And it is quite obvious from the Psukim and from Divrei HaRishayim that the Aseres HaMakos had 2 different objectives. One is, yes, es asher salalti b'Mitzrayim, punishing Parai and the Mitzrim for their evil deeds. But the other was uplifting Bnei Yisrael and showing them the oisis and moisim, the nisim and afrois, b'yodai hachazoko u'vizroya hanotuyo. As I say, asher samti vam. And that is the Kefer Aloshoy. Naman tesaper b'yazne bincho ben mincho. Es asher salalti b'Mitzrayim in one hand, v'esay asher samti vam on the other hand. And the Ramban at the end of the Parsha explains why is Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim so essential. So once a year we have the mitzvah of Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim, but every day, morning and evening, Boker v'Erev, we have the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. And there are so many other mitzvahs that all are Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. Shalosh Hagolim are Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. All the dinam of Bechorah are Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. Tefillin is a Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. And it's in this week's Parsha. And then Ramban explains, why is this so important that we remember Yetzias Mitzrayim? כי מן הניסים הגדולים והמפורסמים, עוד המועד בניסים הנסתוריים, שהם יסוד כל התורה, כולה שאין לנו זה חלק בתורס מוישה, עד שנדע שכל דבורנו ומקרינו הם ניסים, אין בהם טבע ומנהגו של העולם. So the Ramban explains, the reason we need to remember those miraculous events, those supernatural, unbelievable events, is just we should learn from the Nisim HaGedolim VaMeforsumim leNisim HaNestorim. And the Nisim HaNestorim are commonplace. They are every day. But those are the greatest Nisim. So on Hanukkah we commemorate the fact that the Nes was Nimshach Shmoini Yomim. Not only one night, but 8 nights. So obviously, a Nes that happened 8 nights is more inspiring and more uplifting and greater than a Nes that happened once. So how about the Nes that happens Erev Uvoike V'Tzorayim An Niflos An Nifsecho V'Niflosecho Shekol Yom Imanu Erev Uvoike V'Tzorayim. So nature is the greatest Nes. Because nature is no different than miracles. Yes, the Ramban was one of the greatest thinkers of his time. And he writes, Kol dvareinu v'mekreinu u'misim. He obviously was aware that there are forces of nature, laws of nature. And the Rambam, in the very first of the Yud Gimel Ekrim, it's not the Lashon of the Rambam, but it is based on the Rambam in Masechet Sanhedrin. Ani mamin be'emunah shalem shebo yismoch shmoi hu boire v'manig l'kol habruim v'hu levadei osa v'oisa v'yasa l'kol ha'masim. The Rambam definitely was aware that there are laws of nature. But who created those laws? And who activates those laws? And who gives life to nature and to the laws of nature? So science could only explain how, but not why. And science cannot explain how these laws came to be. And that is what the Rambam and the Ramban say. It is all hashgacha protis. So the greatest miracle of all is the miracle of nature. Not one day, not 8 days, but thousands of years. Erev Avoike. Those are Nifsecho v'Niflosecho sheb'chol yom imanu. Erev Uvoike v'Tzorayim. And therefore the Ramban says, it's so important to remember the miraculous. Ki men hanisim ha'gedolim v'amefrasomim od ha'moed b'nisim ha'nestorim shehem yisod kol ha'torah kula. שאין לנו חלק בתורס מוישה עד שנדע שכל דבורנו ומקרינו הם ניסים אין בהם טבע ומנהגו של העולם. But the Ramban also writes another amazing line in the same lengthy discussion at the end of Parshas Bo. תכלס היצירה הראשונה ואין לעליון חפץ בתחתונים אלא שידע האדם ויודע לאלוהיו שבראו. Tachlis Abriya, according to the Ramban, is pashut, is simple. Sheyeda ha'odam v'yodeh le'elikav shebro. We should be aware and thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for creation, for life, for being around and for the ability to live and serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is Tachlis ha'yetzira ha'rishayna. And that is why it is so important that the Yetzias Mitzrayim should live with the people, with Klal Yisrael. Every day we should be aware and thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for life and see HaKadosh Baruch Hu and His manifestation everywhere. In nature, in our day-to-day activities and livelihood, because that is the greatest miracle of them all. And that is the tachlis of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So many times in the past, And in my swarm, whether it's Mechasor Shel Sichos Al HaTorah or Agodah Shel Pesach, I discussed in Lumdis, in Halacha, what is the difference between Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim is only once a year, B'Leila Seda, and Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, which we are Mekayim every day. And the difference is the essential distinction between Zechira, which is Merege Kememra, and Sipur. Sipur is storytelling, and a story demands details. So I once said a mashal, Ma bein Sipur leZechira. It's a modern mashal. Don't look for it in Mishle Adub Nemagid, the Magid Nedum. It's a modern mashal. So, we all have cell phones. We also have telephones, but it's been a while since we used our telephones. Almost nobody uses landlines anymore, even when you're at home. But every cell phone, and I assume every telephone as well. I'm not a tech whiz, I'm not into technology, but I assume every telephone, not only cell phones. One of the features is speed dial. So you just need to push one button, and how many digits in a normal? Is it 10 digits, I think? Yeah? In a cell phone, usually the numbers are 10 digits. Press one button and all the 10 digits come up on the screen. And it's a time saver. But you need to spend some time to put those numbers into the memory. And that's somewhat nerve-wracking, especially when you have a lot of numbers. But in the long run, you're saving time. So when you feed those numbers into the system, you need to take a deep breath and spend some time. But you're going to make up for that time many times over, because each and every time you want to dial, you just press one number. I think that's the difference between Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim and Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim. So once a year, B'Leila Seda, take a deep breath. This is going to take time, and it's Kedai. Invest. B'Leila Seda, you're sitting like a king at the end of the table with a white kittel, and yes, spend some time. But if you invest B'Leila Seda and you feed all those irrigation into the system, all year round, all you will need is just press one button. And that is every day. Boker ve'erev. Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. And if you're probably fed those numbers into the system, then all you will need is just Schira Ba'alma, and everything will come up on the screen. Everything will come up to the surface. And that is what Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim and how Schira relates to Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim B'Leila Seda. So the Ramban explains why this mitzvah is so central and so important in Yiddish life, in Jewish life. Just we should feel that Koros HaTov and the gratitude. Sheyeda ha'odom v'yodeh le'elekov shebaroi. And we should see and feel HaKadosh Baruch Hu every day of our lives. You go out in the morning, and the sun is shining, or it's raining, and it's cloudy, whatever it is. You should see HaKadosh Baruch Hu's glory. You should see HaKadosh Baruch Hu's greatness. You should experience the miracle of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world each and every day of your life. Kimen anisam agadolim v'mifrsomim odem moide benisam anastorim shehem yisod kol ha'torah kulo. Yerotzen shenizke lekach, yerotzen shiur chelkenu amoim, and we should be zoiche ki yameitzeischu mi'eretz Mitzrayim, arenu neflois v'bias goel tzedek b'mheru v'yomeinu omer.